All right, so let's call this meeting of the Board of Zoning Appeals to order. First item of business then is a roll call. So Mark Presley, Cecily Saputo. Also present, we have Miss Rosalie and Jarrett Schaefer from the GNRC, Ron Moreland and Miss Freddie Banks absent. We do have a quorum. Next item is approval of the minutes from the last BZA meeting on September 9th. I think everybody has a copy of that. I'll give you just a minute to go over it. Motion by Mark Presley to approve, second by Cecily Saputo. Any further discussion? If not, all in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carried. Minutes approved. Thanks to the secretary. I should mention we are being recorded, so please remember to key your mic when we're talking. All right, next item on the agenda then is any additions or changes to the agenda. Otherwise, I entertain a motion to approve the agenda as presented.
Motion to approve.
Motion. Could we add another person if someone was interested? Sometimes like tonight, we've already got a forum. I don't have anybody in mind, but.
According to our ordinances, there's a number. The state code says that it could be 5 or 7. I don't think they ever really do.
So we can't have an even number.
Yeah, I don't think they really do. Even numbers, it's either like
5
5 or 7. And with the number of residents of the county increasing, I think we could look at possibly adding 2 people to the Board of Zoning Appeals.
So I suppose I better start with having a motion to add that to the agenda. I assume that's your motion.
Seconded.
Okay, I have a motion to add a discussion on the number of members for the BZA board. Motion by Mark Presley, second by Cecily Saputo. Any further discussion at this point? All those in favor of adding that to the agenda, say aye. Opposed, nay. Okay, so that's added to the agenda. So now I'll entertain a motion to approve the agenda. It's you two. You're just gonna have to take turns.
Second.
Motion to approve the agenda by Miss Cecily, second by Mark Presley. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. The agenda is approved. Okay, any old business? Okay, and we'll move on to new business, which is election of officers.
I'd like to make a motion that we keep the officers the same as we have it right now. I thank everybody that an officer is here, so we're not adding anybody that is not here to defend herself.
So the current officers are Paul Knudsen, Chairman, Mark Presley, Vice Chairman, Cicely Saputo, Secretary. We have a motion to keep officers the same. Is that a second? Motion to leave the officers the same by Mark, second by Cicely. Any further discussion? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. All right, motion carries. We'll hold the same officers over. Next item on the agenda then was a review of Board of Zoning Appeal roles and responsibilities. Actually, the discussion of adding 2 more members to the board might dovetail right into that. I might, my own opinion, Mark, I don't know if adding 2 will help us get a quorum or not, right? Because that's assuming you're gonna attend, right? I mean, we still might have the same issue of barely having a quorum, right? So you add 2, if 50% of them come, then we have 4 out of 7. Now we got 3 out of 5, so. But that's my 2 cents worth. Take it for what it's worth. So do we want to turn this portion into the discussion? Is that what, Jarrett?
Yeah, I think Jarrett and I can cover this. As well, we had the training that was done during the planning commission that we could always refer back to, and I'll send those links for those meetings that this training was conducted. As you can tell on the front page of the packet, the training started February 12th and it continued on for several months. We got through as much as we can during that time, but it's a lot of information because not only does it cover planning, but Board of Zoning Appeals and all the various things that we need to be aware of and conscious of serving on these committees.
Okay, I guess I should have prepared a little better. So I know we can run through this kind of quickly. I know we're gonna have other members who aren't here who may need to hear this as well. And then if you're talking about adding 2 additional people or additional staff, obviously we might need to go through this again. So so basically the authority that the BZA is given was granted by the state constitution. That state constitution really that legislation shapes how the powers are exercised through the Tennessee State Code. So those the TCA powers granted to planning commissions will be different depending on municipality and or if it's regional. They'll be modified slightly because the powers granted to you and the decisions you make will be slightly different, whether it's a regional level or a municipal level. I think you guys are probably pretty familiar with most of this as a practice, but it's a great thing to review. So more or less the 2 powers that were granted to you by the state or the corporate powers, and those are the ones that provide local governments the authority to collect money through bonds, taxes, fees, and assessments. And then your police powers, which are essentially to guide and govern in the development through your code and your ordinances that you have. So anything you put in place, zoning, whether there are major thoroughfare plans, anything that, is kind of in your toolbox to help govern is what guides you through those police powers. So, and then again, so looking at that, the goals are to promote the health, safety, welfare, and morale of the public. Again, these are going to change. This is kind of a living document. Even though, if you look at the revisions we've had over the years, as things come up, developments change, how the town's population shifts and interests will continue to change the document. And you, as well as the public, have the ability to also recommend changes. It's not that it's always going to happen from the public side, but they can make recommendations for changes to our planning and zoning code. So as you can see, page 6, Title 13, the Tennessee Code really is what gives you, the Planning Commission and BZA, your power in making decisions. The public has that ability again to come to you and ask for zoning changes. They request, as you know, a whole number of things. And ultimately, it's up to this board and this body to really take that information, process it, and use those ordinances to help guide that development and come to a finding on what they've brought forth. I don't know if you have anything to add, please jump in.
They, if you notice on page 6, they talk about land use planning, zoning subdivision regulations, and building regulations. In fact, if you drive down Broadway, you'll see a sign across the street from the administration building where it says change of use. So that piece of property is zoned commercial, but it's always been used as a residential structure, okay? So though it's zoned commercial, for someone to buy that piece of property and then operate it as a commercial business within that structure, they have to do a change of use to do that because the land use is different than what it was. And you'll find a lot up from, I would say, where the old train station is. That is zone C1, which does allow for residential use. C2, however, which is the highway commercial, does not really allow for residential use. Now you see a lot of houses, you see a lot of residents living in these houses. That was done, that zoning was done by the state many, many years ago. So if they ever decide to sell, it's still commercial. And some homeowners, property owners, have asked for rezoning to residential. That way, they feel comfortable living there, being a resident. So land use, you'll see more and more about this. Zoning, I know the BZA doesn't necessarily deal so much with the zoning aspect, but you've had cases come before you where setbacks are different for different zones. And they had a request to change some setbacks to meet some of the needs that they had, albeit sometimes the septic system and where the soils area are interferes with what a setback would be for the house that they want to put on that piece of property. And so there's various times where you're going to hear request for that. And the BZA has a little more latitude, wouldn't you agree, than the Planning Commission?
Yes, because typically, like you said, we'll have residents or someone who's looking at buying a piece of property, and they may have a use in mind that's not something that's currently approved. So their only method of trying to get, let's say they want to do like a mixed use project, they're going to have to come before the BZA first to request that zone change. And a lot of the analysis that's going to happen is looking at, as she had mentioned, your setbacks, front, rear, sides, some of your maximum height, and then a lot of factors come into play, whether there's adequate parking. There's so many elements, but that is a right of the public to come to you and request those changes in a zone or a land use. And those, as you continue to grow and maybe the urban growth boundaries stretch and city limits change, I think you'll probably run into more of this. multitude of uses that need to change to kind of adapt to, today.
So, and also too, if you look in our ordinances that we have for our county, we've got the city ordinances and we have the county ordinances. And in those ordinances, you will find, and in fact, I've pulled it up here, where the Board of Zoning Appeals is given the duty to decide various things. For instance, cases requiring variances relative to the above provisions, and they're talking about streets, things of that nature, due to the topographical limitations can be heard and acted upon the Board of Zoning Appeals, provided that no curb cuts for off-street automobile storage or parking space shall be permitted where the arrangement would require vehicles to be at a different or directly onto a public street. So you may hear various cases. And I think you guys were all given a copy of the ordinances back when you first started. It may benefit you to start bringing them to the meeting so that when something happens, now, grant you, they're a little cumbersome to try to maneuver and try to find things. I know if you had it digitally, the search and find feature is very much a godsend because it's very difficult to find it. And the Codes and Zoning Committee is working on combining both of those ordinances, so it'll be a lot easier to interpret and find. Do you guys have any questions so far?
I think when we do our training, we were supposed to be having like the 4-hour training every year. It seems like some of this was already touched on that training that we had in like February or March. Was that correct? Or am I getting that confused with last year's training?
That is correct, but I think a good review, I know that there are going to be some submissions where we need to make sure that we are following and doing our due diligence and following all the rules and regulations.
Yeah, I was just kind of looking through here. So a lot of this is pretty heavily based on planning commission itself versus BZA. So let me kind of skip ahead to kind of page 27, which is kind of more the responsibilities. I think, it's good to see where it fits in with BZA and planning commission. But we'll kind of try to focus more on the responsibilities of BZA. As you can see there, it's required by the state and you perform a quasi judicial function. You're making rulings and you're making determinations based on the information presented to you. And which is a lot of the reason we ask so many questions. Sometimes they seem like, why are we asking that? But we really have to get the clear picture, and I think, I've heard a lot of good questions, people coming up with looking for permits and saying, what are the operating hours? And so we're kind of getting to the root of like our zoning and what it allows and what it doesn't. So, I've heard a lot of good questions from our BZA members here just during our hearings. A lot of the same questions I ask, and a lot of times I sit back and wait and see if they're going to get asked. If not, I ask them. And some of the things we ask, they're silly that we have to ask the same things over and over, but they are in our zoning and they are in our code. And if they're there, we have to ask and make sure we find answers to those. But essentially your job though is to act as a board that hears and it comes with a determination for those applicants. So as you can see, and you're probably aware, you interpret and kind of perfect, but yeah, you interpret the zoning code often. I guess and perfect the zoning ordinance, meaning when we do see things that are not quite right or not working for us, we have that ability to change them. And purely by recommendation. We do that and we can take a vote and make changes. So everything that you see in your zoning are things that we can modify or amend as needed. Again, it's a living document that we want to, constantly be refining so that it works for you. Um, the other bullet points there, safeguard the constitutionality of the zoning ordinance, because it is a written document, it is a rule, it's a law. We have to make sure that the projects that come before us align with those goals and requirements. And ultimately, that's what we're holding it against. So some of the things you'll see that come before you, which mainly kind of falls more on Rosalie and I think is the administrative review of projects. We have to look at it and interpret how well it meets the standards. And what we try to do is present that back in a report to the BZA in kind of a simplified form, how well it meets those standards. And, our findings typically are that it has additional information that needs to be provided, or that it may be completely out of alignment with what the zoning says, and this project doesn't really fit or meet the needs as compared to the zoning code.
Just to add what Jared is saying too, our ordinance, there are some spots that need to be updated. For instance, I've mentioned several times our sign ordinances. You guys felt the pain of having to try to interpret what our ordinance is saying, when in fact it hasn't really gotten up to what is now available for signs. Various other things too, for instance, swimming pools, in-ground swimming pools, by code, by law, have to have, if they don't have an automatic cover over an in-ground swimming pool, they have to have a 4-foot fence around the perimeter of the swimming pool, and it has to be specific. They have to have a locking gate, and that's for building code and state law. But in our ordinance, it says the fence only has to be 3 feet. So if someone were to bring a challenge to me telling them, I'm sorry, but your fence has to be this because our ordinances say that, you guys would hear that type of challenge. And you would have to interpret that and make a decision on that.
So some of the other things, not necessarily in order what's here, but variances, those often come before us. And as Rosalie pointed out earlier, a lot of that could be simple geographical issues. I mean, that's ideally what we want to see in a variance, is that something that's physically limiting on the property as a basis for granting one can't be something that's monetary or, there's woods there, so we don't want to chop them down because it's going to cost us money, isn't really a true reason for a variance. Really what we're looking for is something that has a geographical limitation to it, steep terrain. Your septic is X feet away from your home, so you didn't have the ability to do that. There's a sinkhole. So, they're going to come to us and say, rather than being, a 5-foot accessory setback, we would like to have 3, because that would put us just enough away from some physical thing that would allow us to build, or further towards the road that would allow us to actually utilize our land because of those limitations. And then, special exceptions. Yeah, those can be so many things. It's hard to give a laundry list of them. I don't know if you have a good definition of, I have so many things floating in my head for special exceptions, but I can't pin it on necessarily one thing that come before us.
Again, in our ordinances, if you go to the zoning part and it says, okay, allowed uses, you're allowed to do this, this, and this on that piece of property. Well, there's something else that they would like to do on that piece of property, it doesn't fit in any of those categories. So they have to come to the Board of Zoning Appeals in order to be allowed to do that particular use. Or it could be too, in our ordinances, it also says that certain uses have to have special exceptions, approval by the Board of Zoning Appeals. So you guys are important.
Thinking, sure, that's what I was waiting for.
So in those scenarios where we do get something where the list of allowed uses is limited or maybe not incorporating this generation or whatever the case may be, and we do grant variances on that, is there anything that then takes it to the next stage to start incorporating it into our bylaws and starts adding that type of thing? So if it's like where we've already admitted that type of use per this user, even though it's a special occasion, would it also be grounds to maybe look at the end of the year or have something in place to see if it needs to be incorporated, like we did with our signs?
Well, like, a special exception is a little bit different. It's more, let's say you have agricultural lands and by right, you could build a single family home or you could have a manufactured home there. And if you went down into the table and it said, you know, special exception, something like building a duplex, or I guess that's not a good one. Something, yeah, a lot of times there's a special exception, a special use you could have. Maybe you could have oh gosh, I'm trying to think of one that a childcare facility there is permitted as a special exception. So they would come here and ask, can we, it's not a permitted use, but it is by special exception. We'd like you to determine whether that's an appropriate use for this area. And then that's when we really look at how's that impact the neighborhood? Is it going to have a lot of traffic? Is that going to be, causing a major impact on the road? If so, may it not be something that we think would be compatible with the surrounding land uses. We've had, I've seen fireworks stands on properties, there's so many things that can be at a special exception, and it's based on your primary classification, whether it's like a residential, high density residential. Some will allow duplex and some won't. So, but it's something they need to come before the BZA to get approval for before they move to their next step.
Now, what you can do, if you start to see a lot of these special exceptions, or if you feel very strongly that perhaps our zoning ordinances need to be updated to include this, you could make a recommendation to the Planning Commission and the Codes and Zoning Committee to look at that and see how they can incorporate that into the ordinance. And it would have to be voted on by the county commission. But then again, too, you would also need to check with the county attorney to make sure, you always want to have legal counsel to make sure that whatever we're doing checks all the boxes, that we don't leave anything undone.
What are you gonna?
Nothing. I was just gonna make the comment. I do like when Rosalie sends the packet out ahead of time with the agenda items, then I can go through the codes and look them up and familiarize myself a little bit. And then I also appreciate you guys being here to, I call it, keep us out of the ditch. Because you can't do stuff just because I like it or don't like it.
Well, yeah,
It does have to actually fit and make sense. And I mean, the fact that I don't like something's not a reason to turn it down, so.
exactly. Yeah. So that's part of the responsibility of the BZA and Planning Commission is really to, find a fair and repeatable outcome every time. A lot of planning is based on interpreting code, and that takes interpreting is a common word in the planning world, but really what we're looking for is we want to see the same outcome on every project, the same criteria used to review it against. And really, that's our only way of making a determination. And I think another thing that I look at a lot, and I try to think about, is the compatibility. You know, how compatible is it with the uses that surround it, with the intent of either the zoning or any ordinances you have in place? How well does it align with that? And really, that's usually my basis. Is it's a pretty you're right between the lines. You know, does it meet the zoning code regulations? And if it's 15 feet, it needs to be 15 feet unless they ask for a variance. Go down the line, and then also how compatible is that with like adjacent uses? You know, is a full-time daycare center compatible in the middle of a neighborhood? You know, could or couldn't be. It just really depends on what you know, maybe the thoroughfare plan identified that road as having a higher capacity than what it's currently be used for. Maybe it works, but there's just so much decision making, especially for you in the BZA, to kind of, you know, you're the initial front line of, you know, this is the first stop before they go to planning commission, and it's I think you guys have been doing a great job and asking a lot of good questions about the projects coming before you. So, you know, I feel confident in the group that we have here.
So then I have a question back to Mark's addition to the agenda. Does it fall within our power to even talk about adding 2 more members?
I think, again, we need to seek legal counsel for that, to see what is in our charter. And again, I think that can also be updated as well. There has been discussion about that before. How many do we need to have on the Board of Zoning Appeals? And the state does say several different things, and our charter says several different things, and so do our ordinances. So we'll just, you know, seek counsel and go from there. I personally, you know, it might be a good thing so that we can make sure that we have a quorum. We will have several items. And I think more and more along the lines that we'll need to have BZA meetings.
I got another question. Right now, do we have like, how many absents can you have? I'm not trying to be mean, but I mean, and I think everybody on here, including myself, if there was someone more qualified, I would gladly step away. But I mean, I'm thankful to be on here, but I think anybody would gladly, I mean, if it's work and it's going to be routinely, I think we need to visit that.
I know that there is a limit to the number of meetings that you can miss. But I don't recall exactly that number, and I'd hate to say and be out of turn.
And like I said, I appreciate everybody being on here, but we want to do the best to our ability for the committee.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, I could do a deeper dive into just the BZA responsibilities probably at a later date when we get everyone together and make it more BZA focus. I mean, a lot of this is planning commission responsibilities and roles. You know, they do kind of have a gray area where they both cross over, and they do work in concert together, you know, in the approval process. So, but I don't have anything else.
Thank you so much to review this with us, and look forward to hearing some more.
Anything else that anybody would like to discuss? Chairman doesn't really have anything to report, so how about the building inspector?
I do have, the item that'll be coming before you next month. We are getting more and more building permits by the minute, it seems. There's a lot happening. And I know that there has been some talk about, does this county have a mitigation plan? I'd like to assure you that we do have a hazard mitigation plan that is in place. It gets updated every 5 years. And in fact, we just went through that 5-year cycle, and that has now been turned back into TEMA. And so we do have that.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to say thanks to everybody for coming, and then I'll open it up if anybody's got any other comments. Otherwise, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
Make a motion to adjourn.
All right, we have a motion by Mark Presley, second by Cicely Saputo to adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Opposed, nay. Motion carries. We're adjourned.